Wayzata, Minnesota, is home to one of America's richest and most evil family dynasties. If you've never heard of them, this family dynasty last year made more money than Coca-Cola, Nestle and Chevron combined. In fact, it is the largest private company in the United States, and this company alone controls a large portion of your food supply. They are responsible for supplying food to some of the biggest brands, such as McDonald's, Burger King, Kellogg's, Unilever, Albertsons, Mars, Dunkin' Donuts, Kroger, Audi and many others. Some products they produce are cocoa powder to eggs, salt, sugar, cooking oil, and meat, but you won't find their names on any of these labels. Most of you have never heard of this name before. This is because this American dynasty has worked very hard to stay that way. They don't want you to know what they're doing behind their factory doors. You'll never want to buy their food products again, but it might be unavoidable. Who could be this powerful, you ask? Cargill. Cargill started as a simple roadside building, but today they are much larger. Cargill is the largest privately held company in the United States, and if it went public, it would rank 15th on the Fortune 500 list, just barely beating AT&T. Cargill has its fingers in almost every pie imaginable, from grains to metals, livestock, palm oil, cocoa, electricity, animal feed, and even hedge funds. The total revenue for Cargill 2021 was $134.4 billion, nearly double what other large agriculture companies like ADM and Dreyfus earned in the same period. This makes Cargill larger than the total GDP of Morocco and many other countries. But if you want to buy shares in Cargill, there is no chance. The company doesn't want your money. It has no value to them. Cargill has deliberately remained a private company. For many private companies, going public is the future to boost income massively. But Cargill knows that if it becomes public, it'd be required to report everything to shareholders, which will expose it to the public at large. But would they ever need to? It's not like they need any more income. They secretly control the food industry. They hide from the public eye as best they can. Why? You can't boycott companies you don't know about, and there's too much to boycott Cargill over for me to cover in this video. Source material in the description below. I recommend the Mighty Earth PDF. In the agriculture business, you're at the constant whims of the lands and skies around you: floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, droughts, global shortages of seed. All these scenarios can be a very serious threat to your main moneymakers. When Cargill's primary food exports suddenly dried up, Cargill found themselves in the middle of the Asian financial crisis of 1997. At the time, Cargill was sourcing a lot of goods from Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Korea. But when Asia fell into a financial crisis, it caused a lot of the agriculture producers Cargill was buying from to close down. Suddenly, Cargill couldn't get wheat, soy, and corn from these countries at the same price as they were before, so Cargill ended up losing $4 billion. Which at the time was the equivalent of 8 years of profit for them. It was one of Cargill's biggest losses to date, and it plunged them into debts. Understandably, the Cargill family panicked, so they shook up management and put a new guy in charge to hopefully lead them back to the promised land, and the man they chose to do that was Warren. One of Cargill's most loyal employees that had been working there since 1969, and when Warren stepped up as the head of Cargill, he did lead them back to profitability, but at a huge cost. Cargill needed to dig themselves out of that $4 billion pit, and since one of their most lucrative crops was cocoa, they went on the hunt for an ultra-cheap source, and they eventually found it. On the Ivory Coast during the 90s, children were being trafficked from Mali into the Ivory Coast for slave labor. These kids weren't being paid. They were barely fed, they were physically abused, and they were held hostage on these farms, saying that they were forced to spray pesticides on coca crops without any protective clothing. Some also have said that they were whipped with branches and left in solitary confinement. According to other reports, children who attempted escapes were forced to drink urine as punishment. Others say that their feet were cut open and pepper would be rubbed into their wounds. However, the benefit of this child labor is that Cargill was able to produce extremely cheap cocoa. Companies like Hershey, Mars, Nestle, and Cargill put their orders in as fast as possible. In 2005, the International Labor Rights Fund learned about Cargill's connection to these slave camps and filed a lawsuit against them, Nestle, and Hershey. In 2021, the case was thrown out by the Supreme Court, a massive failure to see reality on the court's part. Since then, Cargill has continued growing their cocoa business under the same practices with similar if not the same suppliers to buy from. In 2018, Cargill put plans in motion, expanding their cocoa storehouses in Abidjan, an Ivory Coast city. In 2019, they invested $113 million into cocoa processing plants in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, and yet around the same time, they talked about how they were allegedly against child labor in press releases. I seriously doubt those statements. Anyway, Cargill needed cheap land now that they had their cocoa business on the rise. Cargill's main business was storing and processing crops, so obviously they needed cheap land to grow cheap crops. Preferable to the company, the land should be free. One of Cargill's palm oil suppliers committed acts of land grabbing in the late 2000s, and yes, land grabbing is as reprehensible as it sounds. In 2011, one of Cargill's palm oil suppliers sent a team of security officers to open fire on a nearby village in Indonesia. They reasoned that a villager allegedly stole a palm fruit. In response, the guards chased 100 people out of their homes, flattening and burning the entire village. Coincidentally, this land was in the perfect spot for a new palm plantation which Cargill was quick to build. A few years later, Brazilian soybean farmers who also supplied Cargill allegedly sent private security forces to a nearby indigenous village. They broke down doors, attacked children, kicked pregnant women in the stomach, and killed 7 indigenous people. Some women lost their children, and what was all this violence for? Someone in the tribe trespassed on the company's farmland, and those natives left their homes because of that. The natives would never come back, and so their land was usurped. It was turned into more farmland to produce even cheaper goods. Sure, the land grab here was good for the companies, but overall, it wasn't enough for them. Cargill wanted to expand more, and unfortunately, in 2004, a huge patch of natural rainforest the size of all of the Hawaiian Islands was removed from the Amazon rainforest. Why this land? For example, the most nutritious crop on the market, soybeans, is grown on these lands and offered for sale abroad at very low prices. Cargill made sure they were the first buyers, but you may remember that there was a whole environmental movement that was starting to gain momentum around that time. Bottled water, fair trade coffee, and t-shirts to save the rainforest. They didn't like how much destruction Cargill caused, so Greenpeace launched the Save the Amazon campaign in 2006, and in response, Cargill publicly agreed not to buy any more soy from deforested lands in the Amazon. Cargill even received a special Environmental Leadership Award for this new agreement. But Cargill seemed to have a plan for this. They had a loophole. Greenpeace had not said anything about Cerrado, another lesser-known but equally important rainforest in Brazil. Cerrado contains 5% of the plant species and animal species in the world, so instead of getting soybeans from the Amazon rainforest, the goods were simply replaced with soybeans from Cerrado. Deforestation slowed exponentially between 2008 and 2012 in the Amazon. While deforestation in Cerrado accelerated in 2018, and Cerrado lost 95,000 square kilometers of tropical forest. That's 2/3 more than the Amazon has ever wiped out, and the Amazon is 3 times larger, so a huge portion of the Cerrado rainforest is now gone. The aliens approached the Cargill ship again and demanded that they stop mining Cerrado. In response, Cargill put on its best PR face. They did not publicly accept Greenpeace's demands but instead created an action plan for branded soybeans. The plan promises that $30 million will be devoted to researching alternatives to growing crops on native lands. It seemed so expensive and out of the norm for the time, but it was pennies to Cargill, like it was making progress when, in reality, the plan was as vague as possible, but it worked after they presented it to the world. They simply turned around and went back to buying soybeans from Cerrado. Cargill's argument against not buying soybeans from Cerrado is that if they move out, someone else will move in, like China. Today, Cargill is still a huge business. It employs a minimal amount of people compared to its profits, 155,000 employees worldwide, and handles a quarter of the country's total grain exports. 20% of the United States' beef and pork comes from their plants. 6 million tons of sugar are transported by Cargill yearly. When making that much money, it can be easy to ignore everything. In the year 2000, 16 million pounds of sliced turkey supplied by Cargill's Texas plant were recalled because they were contaminated with Listeria, a deadly bacteria. The meat caused 7 deaths, 3 stillbirths, and 29 illnesses across 10 American states. The same year, a 3-year-old died from E. coli poisoning after eating beef that came from one of Cargill's processing plants. In 2009, more E. coli-tinted burgers were set out, causing a woman to become paralyzed from the waist down. Why does this keep happening? Because Cargill had discovered an innovative way to save money on their meat processing costs. Here's how. Instead of using expensive cuts of meat to make your burgers, you want to use all those bits of meat and intestines that fall onto your factory floor. Just soak it in some ammonia to kill the bacteria, throw it into a grinder, and you have ground meat that costs 25% less. Fecal matter and other bacteria may end up in the meat intermittently, especially if you're using intestines and other organs. But as long as it's treated with chemicals and the animals are fed human-grade antibiotics, it's totally okay. Just package it up and send it out to the customers who can't afford anything else. One of the defenses larger food companies have to defend this is just a deflection along the lines of, you can't have a bunch of small players delivering such an important food source to the nation's consumers. You have to have larger companies that can do it cheaply and can keep costs down. Not much of a justification when much of the smaller competitors do not have this bad of a track record with food. There is much more in the articles linked below that show even more of the horrors this company has supported and the chemicals released into environments behind closed doors. That's it for now, and I hope to see you in the stars.